for those just entering who I haven't had a chance to meet yet, my name is Rabbi Shani Rosenbaum. I am a member of the faculty of the Rabbinical School at Hebrew College, also an ordinee of Hebrew College, so in the family very much. Want to give a shout out in particular to Wendy Linden, who's going to be our tech master for today, in addition to her general role as director of marketing of Hebrew College. She's also putting on a different hat to help us out with any tech issues that may happen over the course of the next 20 minutes. So our topic for today is divine anger and human anger in the Talmud. And so just a word on why it is that I wanted to sort of have a conversation with our ancestors about the question of anger. Well, it happens to everyone, right? It's happened to you, it's happened to me. And I'm particularly interested in this moment of sort of my own learning in what happens when we enter a conversation with each other, but also with our texts, about things that are just basic human experiences that transcend space and time, which is not to say that over space and time, everyone experiences the same things that we all experience in the same way. So what happens when we consult an ancient text on an experience that's familiar to us is both there are opportunities to find resonance with our ancestors in ways that are surprising. Gosh, I didn't know someone who lived thousands of years ago could be so familiar to me. And also we can find dissonances, just like we find when we have conversations about common human experiences across space with people who aren't ourselves, which is to say, what can we learn about this experience I've had or have observed when I consult someone who's very different from me, living in a very different time and place. So that's my intention over the next 20 minutes for how we're going to explore this feeling of anger. So in exploring the question of how our ancestors experienced, expressed, described the feeling of anger, there are a lot of rich and juicy texts that describe the sages of the Talmud engaged in their own anger, having angry outbursts, reflecting on anger, feeling nervous about anger, etc., describing it. I'm focusing today on a text, and we may get to one or two, but probably just one because time is short, where they imagine and envision the divine, meaning God, being angry. And as we go through, I'm going to ask folks to reflect on sort of what does it mean to describe the divine in this way? And in what way is it useful for thinking about what anger looks like, feels like, and what to do about it when we envision God having this experience too? So those are the questions I want to carry us through the next 17 minutes or so as we look at text. Because we're a relatively small group, I'm not going to be super specific about how we use the chat or how we use comments. So folks can feel free to either physically raise their hand when they want to offer a comment, or just go ahead and throw in the chat that you want to share something, and hopefully we'll have a little bit of a dialogue here. Okay, I am going to share my screen. Okay. I'm actually also going to place the document in the chat here in case that is easier for anybody. You can enlarge it to your liking. Here we go. Okay, can folks see that? Great. And I want to make sure I can see you. Always the trick of a Zoom class. Okay, fabulous. Ellen, is that a raised hand?
Yeah, can you make the print a bit larger, please?
Yes, I can, absolutely.
Thank you.
And you can also zoom in on your own screen, but I can actually make this. How's that for you? Is that better?
Beautiful, thank you.
Great, excellent. Thanks for asking. All right, so we're starting in Masechet Brachot, which is a tractate I'm spending a lot of time with. Our Shana Aleph, our first year rabbinical students, spend all year in this tractate, which has a lot to do with prayer. And the seventh page of this tractate has a long discourse on both human and divine anger. So I want to zoom in on this particular piece. And because it's a small group, I might invite another voice. Anyone feel moved to read?
Yep, I'll
Go
read.
for it, Richard, from Rabbi Yochanan.
Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Jose, from where do we know that the Holy Blessed One prays? As the verse says, and I will bring them to my holy mountain, and I will cause them to rejoice in the house of my prayer. It does not say their prayer, but my prayer. From here we learn that the Holy Blessed One prays.
Beautiful. Just show of hands,
What
has
does he
anyone seen
pray?
this piece before?
Rabbi,
Richard, I'm going to pause you just a moment. I'm going to pause you as we go so we can do a little processing. Has anyone, just show of hands, anyone seen this piece before? Awesome, so it's brand new. You might find this verse familiar from the High Holiday liturgy. We've repeated it a whole bunch of times in the traditional liturgy, sort of a messianic vision of a moment where everyone gathers in God's house of prayer. Here they're sort of zooming in on the very specific language, the house of my prayer, Beit Tfilati, right? Beit Tfilah, my house. The Beit Tfilati, sorry, the house of my prayer. They say, my prayer, it must mean that God prays. Okay, we could spend a lot of time on this piece, but it's actually just the premise for where we're going. So Richard, I'll have you keep going now.
Rav Zutra Bar Tuvia said that Rav said, may it be my will that my compassion will conquer my anger, and that my compassion will win out among my qualities, and that I interact with my children with a quality of compassion and go for them beyond the letter of the law.
Beautiful, thank you. Okay, so what is the content of God's prayer? It begins, may it be my will. This should strike us as funny and ironic if you're familiar with prayers that begin, may it be your will. They're like, how do we conceive of what God's prayer looks like? Who's God praying to? God's self, apparently, okay? That my compassion will conquer my anger. What do you notice? What surprises you about the content of this prayer? Is it what you would have expected? Anyone can chime in.
Well, it very clearly separates God from the person. I don't know, I'm sort of a student of Rabbi Green in sort of God is within.
Sure.
And this is making it quite separate.
Great. This is not only making it quite separate, but quite personified, right? The rabbis don't have a problem imagining God as sort of having human characteristics. And in this particular case, focusing very specifically on the characteristic of either anger or compassion and having the kind of struggle that you and I might have reigning in that thing called anger. Ellen, I see you're unmuted. Did you want to offer something?
Basically just that God is not sure of self-control, so to speak.
Great, great. So the picture we have of the divine here is someone struggling with self-control. Okay, so already we see sort of in our depiction of anger, one of the things that qualifies it is it's hard to contain, it's hard to control, such that even God would struggle with such a thing. Other things you know, yeah, Sharon.
Just two other things that strike me about the language. One is that, it's not, may it be my will that I will conquer my anger, but there's this, right? There's not an I sort of presented, well, maybe in the will, but it's, right, there's a distance there from, let my compassion do that, overcome the anger. So that's just, I'm trying to figure out, what the relationship is between the parts and the whole, and what the sense of self is that's being evoked here for God, and maybe then by extension for us. The other word that strikes me is conquer. Just, I'm not sure we usually think about compassion as conquering. There's so many other words that could have been chosen. My compassion, wash away my anger, may it soften my anger, whatever, but may it conquer, it's kind of like, no, anger needs a force that conquers it. So anyway.
Okay. Really nice. So collecting all of those noticings, what are we learning in this text about what anger feels like and what it looks like? What are we learning about anger here?
Well, it's devoid of compassion.
Good, right? Anger has an opposite. Anger has an opposite, right? And it's compassion. Not obvious. We might think of, right, anger's opposite might be calm, right? There's all sorts of things we might conceive of as the opposite, but for the rabbis, right, it seems like these things are at poles. Awesome. What else?
There's a hint that anger would go with the law, applying the full force of the law.
Great. So that little end piece, right? May I go beyond the letter of the law for my children, implying that a non-angry actor actually is more flexible with application of rules than someone who's acting in anger. Not obvious, again. Right? Maybe you might conceive of a person who applies the rules very precisely as someone not motivated by emotion at all. But here, being exacting and applying the law is associated with the angry pole. Any other lingering insights here, and we can move on to the next piece of the text.
I'm wondering the extent to which it's referring specifically to the 13, attributes, and because there's of which the first one, or the first real one, is Rahum, but Kas doesn't appear. So I don't know. I mean, this idea of God as a collection of attributes seems to evoke that to me. Great.
So, right, another thing some of us might have experienced a whole bunch in the high holiday season, a lot of that high holiday stuff echoing when we want to name God and we want to call God out into this compassionate mode. We recite a series of attributes that were sort of called out on Mount Sinai in the moment that Moses is trying to convince God not to destroy us. And all of those are sort of compassionate and going beyond, right? Not applying the law, but being relaxed about maybe the punishment we might deserve. And we call those God's attributes. We don't call anger an attribute of God, implying maybe that anger is a thing God experiences, but maybe the ideal is that it's not essential to the divine, right? So something essential from me should come up and conquer that thing that is not essential to me. Yeah, Sharon.
Yeah, I've just wondered, because we certainly have plenty of places where God is described as angry. So it really is striking what you're saying, that, what would be the reason to describe God as being angry, but not describe it as one of God's attributes. And I wonder if one possibility is, if we're learning from God's attributes about ourselves, right? Selam Elohim, and there's no place, as far as I know, I don't know if you've come across any place where we are meant to imitate God's anger. That doesn't feel like it shows up anywhere. And in fact, it's a kind of terrifying thought, even as it pops out of my mouth. So anyway.
Yeah. So there is a text we're not going to look at today that doesn't specifically mention God's anger, but sort of allows for an expression of anger that was initially called into question, that was designed to instill fear in a household. That's like the closest I've seen, which doesn't mean it's not also out there. But Sharon, to sharpen your point, I'm going to skip down to a later paragraph within this same text. Sharon, read this for me. The question that's posed by the Gemara.
And is there such a thing?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And is there such a thing as anger for the Holy Blessed One?
Okay. Why is this an astounding question.
Mhm. Wow.
It's a strange question because God is always getting angry.
Great. Have you read the Tanakh? Okay. God is constantly flying into a rage because the Israelites have done something really bad and it makes God angry. And yet something within the text of the Gemara is very uncomfortable with naming that God actually experiences anger. So
This is
what's that about?
Mhm. Wow.
So the response here is as the text. Yeah, go ahead, Diane.
Yeah, interesting. I'm sorry I came in late.
Sure.
What I was thinking is reading this, that you said before, rage and compassion are juxtaposed to each other,
Mm-hmm.
which is what we assume always, and that God was angry a lot. We assume if we read the Tanakh, but this is the first time that I've ever thought that they may be related differently, that they may not be juxtaposed, that there are times that anger or outrage, like you're outraged at social injustice, something like that,
Yeah.
is an expression of compassion,
Right.
as opposed to seeing them as totally juxtaposed emotions. I think because God was portrayed as a man, in a patriarchal way initially, the rage stood out in a certain way. But if you take away that, God being patriarchal, I don't know, it's more interesting to me to think about them as more intertwined emotions, and that he was dealing with what does he do with these humans, and he's, compassionate towards them because they're fucking up.
Right. So many thoughts bubbling up for me. I'm wondering if there's anyone else for whom anything that Diane just shared sort of sparks a response. Feel free to chime in.
Well, it then says that his rage lasts a moment, but his anger at Moses for striking the rock lasted until they reached the promised land, and he still didn't let him get in.
Great. So we can find many examples in Tanakh where it seems like the anger or the results of the anger seems to have had some sort of very negative consequence for the person who was on the receiving end of the anger. To that point, I actually want to jump us for our last minute just to another text sort of in this vein. So earlier on in the same Masechet, and I'll just read this for the sake of time. It was taught that Rabbi Yossi said, once I was walking down the road and entered one of the ruins of Jerusalem to pray. Elijah the prophet came, as he does, and guarded the entrance for me and waited for me until I had finished praying. He said to me, my son, what voice did you hear in that ruin? And I said to him, I heard a heavenly voice sighing like a dove and saying, woe is me that I destroyed my sanctuary and exiled my children among the nations of the world. And he said to me, Elijah said to me, by your life, it is not just in this moment that God is saying this, but every day, 3 times a day, he says this. Okay. What is God's relationship to anger here?
Sadness, right?
Regretful?
Yeah. Right. So if you said, what do you mean? God's anger lasts a long time. Maybe, right, God's anger, as the previous text showed us, lasts a short time, but the effects can actually be quite disastrous. We're being called in back to the room. So the last 20 seconds, I will just thank you all so much for your insight and diving into this for me, and hope that something here sparked something either familiar or new in your own relationship to anger and what it could mean in the course of your own life. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was
Thank you
wonderful.
so much.